Hello, everybody. This is Nick Titero, Professor of Information Technologies and Computer Science, Lakeland Community College. Let's talk about digital audio. Now, before we talk about digital audio, I want to go back in history. I want to go back into our Wayback Machine and talk about just audio files in general. Whether recorded on a tape recorder or an album, those were recorded in what we called an analog signal. If I was to copy that, maybe record from a album over a tape, I would lose some quality. And if we go really way back into our Wayback Machine and talk when I was a kid, if you bought a car, your parents bought a car in the 60s or 70s, a radio was a additional item. You had to pay extra for a radio. Most cars only had an AM radio. As the 70s and 80s came around, we started to see more FM radios in our cars. We had AM, FM radios, and that was a big deal and cost extra and things like that. And you notice a trend there, and it kind of leads into what we're going to be talking about today. The AM stations in the 50s and 60s did play a lot of music, but by the 70s and 80s, the AM stations started to play more talk and news and sports, and the FM stations started to take over the music. If you were around the Cleveland area in the 70s, WMMS, 101.7 or 100.7, that was FM. Why? Why did talk stay on the AM dial and FM go and music go to the FM dial? And actually, we see that in sports too. Really in sports too. Let's go to my screen and let's discuss that. All right. So a analog signal is often represented as a wave, right? Every time we copy that wave, we copy a record to a tape recorder or something like that, we will lose quality because the wave doesn't want to copy effectively. But let's talk about AM versus FM. AM down here is what's referred to as amplitude modulation. They're changing the height of that wave. They're changing the power of that wave. If you grew up in the Cleveland area, Northeast Ohio area in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, maybe even today, you could potentially hear an AM station from Detroit or maybe on a good day, Buffalo, because it would come off the lake and the power. If you get in your car and you start driving east and you're listening to a AM station, you're probably going to get at least to Pennsylvania, maybe even to the New York border. And on a really good day, I know this from personal experience, I hear AM stations from Cleveland all the way up in Toronto, because amplitude has to deal with power, but not quality. Amplitude is power, not quality. Frequency modulation, the number of waves in a certain time frame, that's quality, right? Do the same experiment where you start driving east, you might get to Ashtabula before you start dropping the Cleveland radio stations. You're probably not going to get to the Pennsylvania border before you start dropping the Cleveland station. But the quality, when you do pick up the FM station, the quality is far superior because we have these frequent waves. That is why by the 60s, 70s, 80s, definitely by the 90s, talk radio went to the AM dial. Why? Because voice doesn't require a lot of quality. As long as you can hear the voice, you are fine. That is why telephones and other things like that didn't have that great of receptions. They didn't need it. But frequency modulation, music, rock and roll, classical music, you want to hear everything. You want to hear the quality. So that is why, they began to switch over to the FM dial. Now, years ago, they would have radio stations do both. A radio station would be AM, FM, and you would hear the difference if you flipped over. So AM, power, voice, distance. FM, quality, but shorter distances. So now let's talk about taking that and turn it into something digital. So here we have this analog wave, and we have digital signals within that wave. Now, obviously, if by looking at this image here, The more digital bars, the more discrete points, and that's what these digital bars, they're discrete points of a sound. The more I put in there, the better the quality. At this point, it doesn't matter about the amplitude or the frequency. What matters is the number of digital points I put in there. So digital radio and digital TV, it's not a question of power anymore. It's just a question of the quality of the digital signal, because the more discrete points, the more sampling points I can put into this wave, the better the sound quality will be. But there's a trade-off. Obviously, the more sampling points I put into this wave, the larger the file will become. Right? So let me repeat that. The more sampling points I put in there, the better the quality, but the larger that file is going to become. Now let's take a look at some files that I created. They're all the same file. I have this recording 224. It's .wave. Sometimes you may hear me refer to it as a raw file. That was recorded with my microphone. That was recorded with a Rodecaster 2 mixing board. The microphone is designed for voice or for podcasting, not really designed for music. It's more designed for a podcasting. There is a screen in front of it. That's a pop screen. So if I remove it and I start speaking and I mention pop screen, the air from my mouth and my throat is hitting that microphone directly. By putting the pop screen there, it dissipates, sometimes you may hear it called, diffuses that the actual breath leaving my mouth and my throat. So I keep it there. But I recorded about 9 seconds of an audio file through Wave, through the raw, and it picked up everything. The Wave file picked up everything. Picked up background sounds, whatever. When it got converted to MP3, it removed or compressed all that data, all that stuff that really wasn't important to the sound. It focused on the export function, focused on just getting the sound of the voice. All the other stuff, all the background sound, it ignored. So it shrank the size of those files. So it took that WAV file and it shrunk it down considerably. And if you look, we have, again, the WAV file is 2.48 megabytes. And then the different MP3 files is 43.6 kilobytes, thousands of bytes, 79 kilobytes, or even 128 kilobytes, because it got rid of all that extra stuff. Now, before we go any further, when it comes to audio files, having the WAV file, having that raw file is a good thing, but for the average individual recording, it's not that important because we may not want that sound. But we can always subtract, we cannot add. So with that WAV file, we can't make it bigger, we can't pick more. Once it's recorded, it's recorded. Now that's really important with imaging and videos. Audio files, maybe not so much unless you're really in a mixing station or something like that. So getting rid of that extra noise compresses the file size. But what changes the file size is the sampling rate. How many discrete points are within that wave? So going to go to another screen. Here are the 4 files, right? I opened up the 4 files in a program called Audacity. It allows me to manipulate audio files. And we're going to start with this one up here. Now we're going to start down with this one right here. This is down in this corner here. That's the WAV file. That is coming from this podcasting mic going into a Rodecaster 2 Pro mixing board, Rodecaster 2 Pro 2, going into a mixing board and saving it as a WAV file. So that's going to be the best quality I have. It is sampling at 48,000 hertz or 48K hertz, but I'll just say 48,000 hertz. That's the sampling speed, how quickly it's sampling all this given information. So it's going to have the best quality. And it may be hard to tell on your screen, but each one of these points is a sample point. So each one of those points is a point in the wave. The more points, the better the wave, the better the sound quality. If we go over to this screen, this is the MP3 file. This got converted or exported from the WAV file. This was sampled at 44, so about 4,000 less hertz sample cycles. It's still not that bad. It's still pretty good. Now, most podcasting and most audio files are at the 44 kilohertz, 44,000 hertz, 40,001. Again, you notice at each one of these discrete points, that is that discrete point along the wave. Now let's go to 22 kilohertz or 22,000 hertz. You will notice just by looking at it, the discrete points are getting further and further apart. There's less sampling, so the quality is going down. And then finally on this last one, it's the lowest quality. It's just a good quality. It's 11,000 or 11K hertz, kilohertz. You'll notice, look at the difference between here and here. And what you would notice on the sound quality, if you were to pay attention, is the 11 would sound a little more muffled, a little bit more like you were in a cave, not an echo, but more of a cave, a little bit soft, where these bottom two, the 44 kilohertz or the 48 kilohertz, much sharper, much cleaner. Now, many of the podcasting platforms, Apple and Spotify, they're fine with the 44 because of the quality. So next time you listen to a podcast, I love podcasts. Next time you listen to a podcast, listen if you hear a lot of almost a muffled sound. It's a good chance they're sampling at a slower pace, right? Versus something sharp and clear. They're probably sampling at a much higher. Now, there's a lot of other factors. In my particular studio, I have a couple dampening boards, but I don't have all that foam board to prevent echoings or stuff like that. Because again, I'm doing mostly verbal podcasts. Now, let me wrap up here. So when we're talking digital audio files, the higher the sampling rate, the better the quality, but the larger the file. The lower or slower the sampling rate, the lower the quality. Very similar to AM versus FM. If you are just recording voice, or maybe you're doing a memo on your phone, the quality does not have to be that good. Now, I don't know what the sampling rate for a simple memo may be, but it has to be low because it's a simple memo. But the sampling rate for a typical podcast machine, sample rate for computers are at least 22, probably at about 44, but the files aren't that big. Now, WAV files, they tend to get very big. In other videos, when I discuss imaging and videos, those files can get massive, but audio files, pretty decent. So, what about music? What about high quality music that you might get download from a service, or I'm going to date myself here, a CD or something like that? The sampling rate is going to be much higher than an audio or a verbal sampling rate because they want you to hear the best quality possible. So very similar to the old days of AM versus FM. AM, power, distance, not too good a quality. We hear more talk radio. FM, much better quality, more beats in there. There we're listening to music. Same thing with audio files. The higher the sampling rate, the better. So music is going to have a much higher sampling rate than an audio file. So with that being said, let's go and learn something.